Most people step into intermittent fasting with the belief that it is some kind of metabolic spell, a shortcut to rapid fat loss that requires nothing but skipping breakfast. This illusion often forms after hearing success stories stripped of the struggle behind them. The truth is, your body isn't a machine that instantly obeys a new eating schedule. It's a complex system shaped by decades of habits. When this reality doesn't match the fantasy, disappointment comes fast. Another problem is that many believe fasting instantly boosts willpower. In reality, the beginning of the journey feels more like a negotiation with your impulses than a triumph over them. Your brain, used to routine caloric availability, sends signals urging you to return to what feels safe. Without understanding this biological pushback, beginners often misinterpret it as failure. There's also a widespread misconception that hunger is the enemy, and resisting it is a test of character. Hunger, especially during the first days of fasting, is simply a messenger showing your metabolism is adjusting. Misreading this natural response leads people to panic or quit prematurely, convinced their body isn't made for fasting. And perhaps the most damaging myth is the idea that fasting alone creates results, independent of lifestyle. When people believe the fast is doing all the work, they overlook crucial factors like sleep, nourishment, and emotional stability. This myth sets unrealistic expectations that collapse quickly when real life enters the scene. The human body has a remarkably adaptive energy system that shifts between glucose and fat as fuel, but this transition doesn't happen instantly. Many beginners overlook this metabolic flex and expect fat burning to ignite the moment they stop eating, without understanding that the body first depletes stored glucose before dipping into fat reserves. Frustration becomes inevitable. What most people don't realize is that metabolic adaptation varies dramatically from person to person. Someone with high insulin levels can take much longer to access fat stores during a fast. When they feel sluggish or hungry, they assume fasting isn't working, rather than seeing it as a natural stage of adjustment. Scientific studies repeatedly show that this metabolic transition is gradual, not immediate. Another overlooked detail is that the brain initially resists switching fuel sources. During the very early stages of fasting, it amplifies hunger signals because glucose availability drops. This is not a warning sign, but rather an expected neurobiological response. Understanding this removes much of the fear that accompanies early hunger waves. One more critical point beginners miss is that energy isn't just physical, it's cognitive. Your mental performance might dip slightly before rising again as ketones begin to increase. When people aren't warned about this temporary dip, they misinterpret it as a personal limitation instead of a predictable metabolic rhythm. There is something almost intoxicating about deciding to start intermittent fasting. Many feel an immediate surge of confidence simply because they've made the choice. But this emotional high can create a blind spot, believing enthusiasm alone will carry them through the first day. When hunger arrives earlier than expected, the fall feels sharper than it should. A common scenario looks like this. Someone wakes up excited, skips breakfast with ease, and by mid-morning feels empowered. Then, suddenly, cravings hit with surprising intensity. This contrast between confidence and challenge often leads to impulsive decisions, like overeating later or abandoning the plan entirely. Not because fasting is hard, but because expectations were unrealistic.
What often goes unnoticed is that overconfidence disrupts preparation. Beginners assume they don't need to adjust their previous day's meals, sleep, or hydration, yet these factors heavily influence how the first fasting window feels. Without preparation, even a simple 16-hour fast can feel like a marathon. Finally, the first-day confidence trap hides an important truth. Fasting success is built on consistency, not willpower peaks. Emotional momentum fades quickly. What carries you forward is structure, understanding, and realistic expectations, not a burst of motivation that dissolves by lunchtime. Many people mistake emotional triggers for physical hunger, especially when starting fasting. Stress, boredom, and anxiety can create sensations almost identical to true hunger. When beginners ignore this distinction, they believe they're failing the fast, when in reality they are confronting years of emotional eating patterns. An interesting pattern emerges during the first fasting attempts. People feel proud for resisting food early on, but then crumble when emotions spike later in the day. This leads to guilt, which then gets mislabeled as lack of discipline. The problem isn't discipline, it's misidentifying the source of the urge. Emotional hunger doesn't follow physiological timing, it follows psychological waves. Science shows that emotional cues activate reward pathways in the brain more strongly than caloric needs do. This means that during fasting, when habits are disrupted, emotional eating signals can become louder. Many beginners aren't prepared for this internal noise, which is why the struggle feels so personal and so intense. Yet emotional hunger can also be the most revealing teacher. Recognizing these patterns helps people understand why they ate the way they did before fasting. This awareness transforms fasting from a simple dietary strategy into a deeper form of self-observation, something that, ironically, becomes one of the greatest sources of long-term discipline. Rushing into fasting with the sole goal of rapid weight loss is like starting a journey while staring only at the finish line. When people expect fast results, they interpret every small challenge as failure. This impatience creates pressure that amplifies hunger, anxiety, and self-criticism, turning the experience into something far more stressful than it needs to be. Weight loss urgency also leads beginners to choose fasting windows that are too aggressive for their current lifestyle. They jump into 20-hour fasts because they believe more is better, ignoring that the body adapts in gradual steps. This mismatch between expectation and physiology is one of the main reasons people quit within the first week. Another consequence is overlooking nourishment. When the mind is fixated on the scale, food choices during the eating window become rushed, unbalanced, or overly restrictive. This weakens hormonal stability, especially leptin and ghrelin regulation, which makes fasting harder instead of easier. Ironically, the pursuit of fast results slows down real progress. And here's something important. Obsession with speed prevents people from noticing their wins: clearer focus, better digestion, calmer evenings. These subtle but powerful signals are what reveal fasting is working long before weight loss appears. By the way, tell me in the comments, what do you think people rush the most when starting intermittent fasting, the results or the process itself? Many beginners believe that choosing an eating window is as simple as picking numbers: 16 by 8, 18 by 6, 20 by 4. But the body doesn't operate on clock logic. It operates on metabolic rhythms. When people pick a fasting window because it sounds impressive rather than compatible, they collide with a schedule their biology isn't ready for. This mismatch creates unnecessary struggle. Another source of confusion comes from comparing fasting windows with friends or influencers. What works for someone with low stress, stable hormones, and a predictable routine may not work for someone juggling shifts, children, or irregular sleep. But instead of seeing these differences as normal, beginners often see them as personal shortcomings, which erodes confidence before consistency even forms. There's also a hidden assumption that shorter eating windows produce faster results. Scientifically, this isn't always true. The effectiveness of fasting depends heavily on metabolic flexibility, not the strictness of a schedule. When people tighten the window too early, they trigger rebound hunger, overeating, and fatigue, reactions that are biological, not behavioral. And perhaps the greatest misunderstanding is the belief that eating windows are fixed rules rather than adaptable tools. The most successful fasting journeys happen when people adjust their window based on stress levels, sleep quality, training load, and mood. Flexibility isn't a weakness in fasting, it's a metabolic advantage. A surprising number of beginners develop a quiet fear of food once they start fasting. They assume that eating too much during the eating window will erase their fasting efforts. This mindset transforms nourishment into a threat and creates an unhealthy tension around meals. Instead of supporting the fast, this fear weakens metabolic balance. When restriction becomes excessive, the body responds with hormonal backlash. Leptin drops, ghrelin spikes, and cortisol rises, a combination that increases cravings and decreases satiety. Many interpret this as a failure of discipline, but it's simply physiology pushing back against deprivation. Fasting works because of hormonal alignment, not caloric panic. Another problem is that fear-driven eating leads to nutrient-poor meals. People focus on eating light instead of eating right, skipping proteins, healthy fats, and essential micronutrients. This leaves the body undernourished, which makes fasting feel harder each day. What should feel like steady adaptation becomes a cycle of weakness and frustration. Ultimately, fasting is not meant to shrink your meals. It's meant to restructure your timing. When people stop fearing food and start valuing nourishment, they discover the true freedom of fasting, the ability to eat well without guilt, knowing their body is working with them, not against them. Sleep is one of the most underrated pillars of successful fasting. When people start fasting without improving their sleep, they unknowingly increase the difficulty of the process. Poor sleep elevates cortisol, which makes the body cling to glucose and intensifies hunger signals. The result? A fast that feels twice as hard for reasons that have nothing to do with food. Most beginners underestimate how deeply sleep influences appetite-regulating hormones. Ghrelin rises when sleep drops, while leptin, the hormone that signals fullness, decreases. This hormonal shift can make even a manageable fasting window feel unbearable. Without this understanding, people assume fasting isn't for them, when the real issue is sleep deprivation. Another overlooked detail is cognitive fatigue. When the brain is tired, its demand for quick energy increases, making cravings sharper and more persistent. This has nothing to do with actual caloric need. It's the brain trying to compensate for lack of rest. Many mistake this mental fog as a fasting side effect, when it's actually the body begging for sleep. Healthy fasting is built on recovery, not restriction. When sleep improves, hunger stabilizes, cravings weaken, decision-making strengthens, and metabolic flexibility increases naturally. Fasting becomes smoother not because the window changed, but because the foundation finally did. Hydration is one of the simplest yet most neglected elements of fasting success. In the absence of food, the body loses a major source of electrolytes, and without replenishment, symptoms like headaches, fatigue, irritability, and sluggishness appear quickly. Many interpret these sensations as signs that fasting is harming them, when they are simply signs of dehydration.
Water plays a critical role in maintaining blood volume, supporting kidney function, and regulating energy production. When beginners fast without increasing water intake, their body works harder with fewer resources. This imbalance makes the fasting window feel like an uphill battle instead of a natural metabolic shift. Another key factor is that dehydration amplifies hunger signals. The brain often confuses thirst with hunger because both sensations trigger similar pathways. When hydration is low, hunger feels louder and more urgent. Correcting this simple issue can dramatically improve fasting comfort within a single day. Electrolytes also matter, especially sodium, potassium, and magnesium. These minerals support nerve function and prevent the dizziness or weakness that many beginners encounter. With proper hydration and electrolytes, fasting transforms from an exhausting experience into a stable, energized rhythm. A common misconception is that fasting erases the consequences of poor food choices. Beginners assume that as long as they stay within their window, any meal is fair game. But the body still responds to the quality of nutrients, and the hormonal impact of food doesn't disappear inside the eating window. If anything, it becomes more noticeable because meals are fewer. Highly processed foods trigger sharp glucose spikes, followed by equally sharp crashes. This instability makes the next fasting window harder, not easier. Many people think fasting is the problem, but it's actually the meal that broke their balance. Stable energy comes from meals rich in protein, fiber, and healthy fats, not from convenience foods.
Another overlooked point is how poor food choices affect inflammation. Studies show that high-sugar, low-nutrient meals raise inflammatory markers, which can interfere with appetite signals, metabolic efficiency, and mood. When inflammation rises, fasting becomes more uncomfortable and less sustainable. Eating windows are opportunities, not loopholes. The more nourishing the food, the more supportive the fast becomes. Fasting doesn't grant permission to ignore nutrition, it amplifies the consequences of both good and bad choices. Most beginners assume hormones are static, but fasting interacts directly with systems that rely on stability, especially insulin, cortisol, and thyroid function. When someone begins fasting without knowing their hormonal baseline, they misinterpret normal adaptation signals as problems. The body isn't malfunctioning, it's adjusting to new timing cues that influence metabolism. For individuals with elevated cortisol or irregular menstrual cycles, fasting introduces additional stress the body might not be ready for. This doesn't mean fasting is harmful, it means it requires awareness. Scientific literature shows that hormonal balance influences everything from hunger waves to energy levels during fasting. Without knowing this, people judge their body unfairly. Understanding hormones before fasting is like checking the weather before a long trip. You're not preventing the journey, you're preparing for it. And with preparation, fasting becomes smoother, safer, and far more sustainable.
Many beginners try to maintain intense workouts while starting intermittent fasting, believing discipline should override fatigue. But training during the adaptation phase demands metabolic flexibility, something the body is still learning. When the system isn't ready, the result is dizziness, weakness, or a dramatic drop in performance that discourages beginners quickly. A common mistake is fasted high-intensity training. Studies show that while low-intensity movement pairs well with fasting, intense workouts rely heavily on readily available glucose. When glucose is low and adaptation isn't complete, the body struggles to meet demand. This mismatch leads to frustration, not because exercise is the problem, but because the timing is. Fasting works best when workouts are aligned with energy availability. When beginners adjust intensity and choose the right moment to train, they discover that fasting and exercise don't compete, they synchronize. Intermittent fasting requires more than a schedule. It requires intention. Without a clear reason to fast, improving metabolic health, reducing inflammation, gaining clarity, or exploring discipline, the first waves of discomfort feel pointless. Purpose is the anchor that prevents beginners from abandoning the process at the first sign of challenge. People who start fasting only because it's trending lack the emotional foundation needed for resilience. Science shows that intrinsic motivation strengthens adherence to any lifestyle change, especially one that temporarily disrupts routine. When purpose is missing, discomfort becomes amplified and progress feels meaningless. But when someone understands why they're fasting, every hunger wave becomes data, every challenge becomes an experiment, and every victory feels earned. Purpose transforms fasting from a dietary technique into a personal evolution. If you want to understand even deeper what actually happens inside your body the moment you begin intermittent fasting and why knowing your purpose makes the journey smoother, make sure to watch This Is What Happens When You Start Intermittent Fasting, Science Explained. It will give you the perfect next step after everything we've just uncovered here. Intermittent fasting reveals patterns that were invisible when eating was frequent: emotional triggers, stress responses, habits tied to routine rather than hunger. This self-awareness can feel uncomfortable at first. Many people expect fasting to be a battle with food, but soon discover the real battle is with automatic behaviors shaped over years. As the eating window narrows, clarity expands. People begin to notice how certain foods affect mood, how stress influences cravings, and how rest shapes appetite. Fasting becomes a mirror reflecting the relationship someone has with discipline, comfort, and personal boundaries. This introspection surprises beginners who thought fasting was simply about skipping meals. And here lies the beauty. The longer someone practices fasting, the more they realize it's a journey of self-understanding. Food becomes intentional, hunger becomes informative, and the body becomes a partner instead of an obstacle. If this video helped you see fasting in a new way, leave a comment sharing what fasting has already taught you about yourself. If you enjoyed this video and learned something valuable, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs this clarity before starting intermittent fasting. And if you want to support this channel even further, feel free to tap the super thanks. It truly helps us continue creating high-quality, science-based content for you.